It's been an interesting journey because number one is I felt I was ahead of the curve from a technology perspective, and I'm just now seeing what I envisioned 17 years ago.
Yeah.
Technology is now starting to be embraced. They're struggling with how to make that sense. When I was up in Philadelphia talking to all the superintendents, they were talking a lot about robotic mowers. That's a big topic.
It's huge.
But what I found interesting is that a lot of the robotic mowers require GPS signals. How does a robotic mower work in the trees?
Yeah.
It doesn't happen. You don't have that aerial signal coming down. So there's a company out there that actually has repeaters or devices out on the golf course to basically send that signal underneath the canopies of the trees. So
great. It's so great that we have people like that and like you that are applying that to a game that is, or an industry that previously had been so slow to change, and it's a great time to be in the business because now there's just so many good things going on, and as researchers, it's a privilege to be able to help inform what their go-to-market strategy is and understand how they're going to be received by various stakeholders, and to see a greater receptivity than maybe there was even 5-10 years ago.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one piece of advice, and you may charge me for it.
No.
So one of the challenges that I see as a small company is getting attention and mind share. And a lot of the larger organizations, and I've dealt with a lot of Fortune 500 type clients of mine. I was in that, and my favorite comment is I found it easier to sell a multi-million-dollar software hardware solution to a CIO, CEO than this $10,000 product to a club. And I didn't realize how many decisions are being made there.
Yeah, especially
and the limitations put on the superintendent. Most of those guys said my budget is X, but I only can spend $2,500 max without having to go through some sort.
And then he's got to go back to the green committee if he's at a private club and get 12 other egos to agree or disagree.
Yeah. So
the question:
how do small entities like myself, because we're now starting to see traction. We've got a relationship with Club Car. We just signed an agreement with Golf Logics. Behind the scenes, I have a meeting with EasyGo in a couple of weeks. So they're now starting to wake up because I feel we've paid our dues and we've been around for a while. And I know that to some extent, people are not always going to be early adopters. They're going to be somewhere in that continuum of the buying process. And I want to be up there in the early majority kind of approach. What can you do to what advice can you offer us to kind of understand how we can accelerate that buying process to help accelerate our growth? Because we've been positioned for 10 years now of growth, but we're not seeing that customer come and buy because of maybe it's too many factors and limitations out there.
You raise an interesting challenge, and it's not immune to an organization like ours. I mean, I noted when we first met, we've both had our companies for the same amount of time, and we're both relatively nimble in terms of our staff. I think when you're in that position where you don't have scale and scope, that can be an advantage because there's a certain personal relationship-driven component of how you approach different prospective clients that a large company doesn't necessarily afford. But I think you hit on one thing that's really critical, and that's partnerships and getting those bellwether relationships that can often virally spiral. You get a large organization, a reputable organization in your corner, and they can create the networks and the introductions and provide the legitimacy to what you're doing that you wouldn't have if you just were kind of trying to slug it out in the smaller levels. And then the other piece, which this podcast is part of, is about thought leadership, about we're never going to buy advertisements in magazines as a company. We're going to go but we're going to do our podcast. We're going to be on other podcasts. I've written a column in Media Post every month for 18 straight years, haven't missed a month. I make our data available through our newsletters and other communications vehicles. So it's out there demonstrating what you can do. And then obviously, hopefully you get some really nice vocal champions and it becomes all viral. That's the way, at least, that we've tried to scale it. And I think we've done a good job of it in our business. And I would suspect in yours too, because, you get some of those big companies behind it. You get, an Oakmont or some of the major championship sites, and then it becomes a platform from which you have legitimacy to go to others. And, you speak at conferences, maybe, you do come out to some of these things, and you'll find yourself, there's always people looking for content and looking for innovation. So if you position yourself in that way, and you naturally can get there, and you've got 17 years of background to show it, you're not one of these fly-by-nights. Right. So many of these companies show up and they're here and gone in 2 years. That can go a long way.
Right.
And at the same time, I got to say it as a researcher, you got to keep your ears and eyes open, because you got to understand what the customer or the prospective customer wants.
Right.
And I've always been about a customer-centric approach rather than a product-centric approach.
Okay.
Especially in what we do. There's a lot of research companies that are out there. They're all about methodology. We've got AI. We're going to go out there and, create all these narratives based on past data.
Right.
And I'm going to be more about, what do you need? And how do we get at that, being thoughtful to your specific circumstance?
So the golf industry being high touch, and this is interesting. High touch is, we have, our point of entry into a golf course is a player. It could be a greens chairman. It could be the president of the club. It could be the head golf professional director of golf. It can be the superintendent or director of agronomy. We have multiple touch points in which can be that entry point. We don't get very many positive responses from a superintendent or a golf professional when we're trying to do outreach to them. Why is that driving? Because, I was up in Philadelphia, and I was talking with we have what we call an ambassador program where, these individuals are responsible for staying in touch with our existing customers. Mm-hmm. And when we onboard a new customer, about 2 weeks to 3 weeks out, they reach out to them and say, okay, how's everything working? Follow up and stuff like that. And I'm a big believer in that high touch arena. But for a high touch industry, in fact, one of my guys related a story. He was talking with an assistant in the pro shop and wanted to see the head golf pro, and he saw the head golf pro sitting in his office doing nothing, just listening to the conversation, but he didn't have time to come out and say hi. Why is there a resistance for, and you go to a superintendent's facility and you say appointment by sales only, and I won't name the facility, but it's a facility.
No, we saw it all the time in my PGA days. It's an industry that is still slow to change, even though we're in a moment now that is seeing more change than it's ever seen. There's still a lot of folks that are concerned and afraid of the unknown. They are, when you're selling into a golf facility, especially if it's a one-off,
right,
you've got multiple layers of constituents and stakeholders that you need to kind of get through. It's not easy.
No.
That's again where I kind of go back to, if you can gain the endorsement of a larger body.
Well, whether it's you even see that same thing there too. It's pushing your rope. Getting club car. Day one, I said club car is going to be my target. 15 years later, they are in the fold. So, but again, and I've had customers, would come by the booth at trade shows, and I'd see them year after year after year, and finally I asked one. I said, "Why did it take you 5 years to make the decision?" He goes, "I wanted to make sure you were around." Very legitimate answer.
Absolutely.
So
it's like so many things, it's building trust and credibility, and you can't underestimate the value of viral endorsement from the right people. I've been fortunate to some degree that I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of folks in the industry and be introduced to them during my corporate career, that people kind of began to get an appreciation for what could be done, and hopefully they saw me as honest and trustworthy and smart. And I often joke, nobody ever hired me for my golf ability. They hired me for what I got between my ears.
Right.
And from, thankfully from that, I think about it. Being in this thing for going on 30 plus years now, I call ourselves a 17-year-old startup in a way. But it's not easy. And there's so much change and fluctuation. And you can find yourself sometimes, you build these relationships and then those people don't stick around. So how well do you hardwire yourself through other layers of the organization? It doesn't always work out that way. But the companies in the tech stack that I see doing really well now, some of whom are very young and run by, very aggressive entrepreneurial young people, they've demonstrated their proof case, but they've also been relentless networkers, and to do it in a way that is authentic, as opposed to, there are a lot of people in this industry who have always just been very transparently sales only people.
Mm-hmm.
And, the couple folks that I'm thinking about as I say this, right away they're pretty smart, and that what they're doing is interesting and unique. And, if you're open-minded enough, you can do it, but it's still not speaking to the majority out there.
Right.
Like again, at TechCon, I made this comment during my presentation. I'm standing in front of a room of a couple hundred people who are at this conference, but these are the couple hundred people who have already bought into technology and are the first movers and the innovators. There's another several thousand out there that are much more reluctant. And when we do the national survey, that's where you see it. That's why you still have, interestingly enough, and I just remembered the stat, you still have only 25% of facility owners right now that believe that AI is going to significantly transform the industry within the next 5 years. Mm-hmm. Now, that number's gone up.
Right.
But it's still only 25% that strongly agree with that. So you've got, you've got the diffusion of a product and an innovation.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating how time is kind of what takes to basically get there and get that momentum there. So what is, and one of the challenges we have is getting into, management companies. Troon as an example, we have probably 15 or 20 facilities that are Troon managed to some extent. I love their business model, but we can't get any traction at the corporate level.
Interesting.
Because, and I'm sure they get banged on by everybody.
Yeah, they get banged on by everybody. I mean, again, as I said earlier, I have the utmost respect for that organization and its leadership.
I've always felt, and this is kind of one of those things that, when, I was at, a client yesterday, and, they're Yamaha, and they've got the Yamaha, technology on their carts. And he goes, how do we get easy locator on that Yamaha cart? I said, pretty easy. We do that with a club car today.
Yeah.
But it's the other side of the fence. They're not, if they don't want to play with me, there's nothing I can do.
Right.
However, one of the lessons I learned in the technology space is the customer is pretty powerful. And if the customer would go to manufacturers,
if they're demanding it and saying
that demand you do it.
But that's a tougher task, because to build that up virally, it's easier now than it's ever been, but that's not necessarily the first path that I would try. I would ask yourself, you've had success with Club Car.
Right.
How did you build that relationship? Who was it? Was it an individual that you got? How did you hardwire yourself?
We've been doing the same thing with all the big guys that we've done then. And it's really kind of interesting, and even as good of a relationship we have with them, it was just one day, Club Car decided that they want to have a differentiator between their competitors, and so that's where, you mean we can do that? We can do that, and they finally were able to apply a resource, and I think the fear from their perspective. And they told us afterwards that their fear initially with doing that is they've never had success with a third party before.
Okay, that's a real important insight, right?
Yeah,
you got to break down that barrier.
Yeah. So, and we're the only company out there that they've had success with today.
Interesting.
Yeah.
See, and that's an important learning. You got to understand the culture of the organization and how change gets.
Well,
within.
I've always basically put it, we want 100% customer satisfaction, and whether it's a partner or a direct customer, I've always said we got to do the right thing. Patience is not my virtue. I tell all of our customers, I'll answer the phone at 5 a.m. if I know you're calling, because I'm that same way. When I have a problem, I want an answer now, because I don't want to deal with it. There's so much. And we had Rhonda isn't here, but she, we have all of our staff take their turn in the barrel on the weekend. And she received a phone call from a customer, and she answered the phone on Saturday. And the customer goes, I wasn't expecting an answer.
Hey, 75% of success is showing up. I said before.
And so she couldn't solve the problem. So she made a phone call to another peer, And he had the answer.
And at least she was on it. At least the customer knew that you were dealing with it, and a human being was dealing with it, as opposed to having to navigate through this large.
And so William solved the problem, and we come to realize that the customer had an event on Sunday, and if we hadn't responded on Sunday, he would have been doing one of these things out there. So
no, I think that and that's another way you differentiate yourself from others. I mean, I'm ridiculously. I actually got an interesting story. I was at we used to do a time management seminar when I was working my way up through the Market Research Association, trade association research that I was president of ultimately. And I did this presentation about why my cell phone is with me all the time. And I'd probably say that I am, if it's something that I'm expecting or something that's like a real, not just a blind solicitation, I will always answer it before the day is out. And I will probably answer it within a couple of hours if I can.
Right.
And this even applied to when I'm on vacation or when I'm on the golf course.
Right.
And part of the reason why I do it, I mean, from a selfish standpoint, it means that I'm on top of things and I don't have to worry about coming back and having hundreds of emails that are unanswered.
Right.
But from a customer service standpoint, who else is doing that? It's a point of differentiation, and it's showing that you're there, and you're not just about the transaction, you're about the relationship. And we've got different business models, but I mean, like, my goal with my company has never been about becoming so scalable that I can't personally be involved in every study that we do. Our goal is to build relationships that are deep but narrow.
Right.
And I've had plenty of opportunities to go and change that model, but that's not what I get excited about. I want to see ourselves as an extension of the companies that we work with. Again, that's not necessarily transferable to a more volume-driven business.
Because we recognize we're the technology expert. Our customer is not. And I said, I want you to treat us as an extension of your organization, whether it's a technology issue that we have, you have with us or someone else, we touch multiple things. We got the internet, we got our servers and all that other stuff. And I've always made comment to our customer, whether it's our problem or not, we want to take ownership of it, and we'll solve it for you. And we've had a number of times where a customer can't print something out. Are you going to call HP? And we solve the problem for them. And
that's something that you probably want to publicize as much as you can, because I don't think a lot of other organizations are doing it, assuming you can keep that up at scale. I mean, that's the big challenge that I think a number of the tech entrants in golf are going to have, is making sure that they have the ability to service a very demanding, scrutinized customer. If you mess up and it reflects on the superintendent, people's jobs could be at stake. So you got to make sure. So that's some of the hesitancy probably. People don't want to talk to you. They'd rather do it the way that they did it all along, where they know they're in control, as opposed to taking a risk.
I tell everybody this story, and is that you go into the golf course and you walk through the pro shop and they go, "Hi, Mr. Schultz, how are you?" What on and on. They want to greet you and make you feel really good. You get off the golf course asset. You go try to find that superintendent. If you're driving down the cart path and you see him coming, at you, the first thing he does is turn around and head off to some other direction. They're more introverted than they are, extroverted. In most cases, a lot of them there are exceptions, but they tell me all the time that they just want to grow grass. They're grass farmers.
Of course. I mean, the job has become so different over time too. I mean, you see it, again with everybody's got to be more accountable for the ultimate end product. So inevitably, you've got to be somewhat customer facing. We have a wonderful superintendent at our facility, and he's out there, and people have a relationship with them. And
so, where do you play?
I play at Sunningdale in Scarsdale. We're a client of yours. I was telling our superintendent when you were on our podcast, and he's like, "Yeah, I know John. He's a great guy." He's done a terrific job there. What beautiful.
And the times I've talked to him, he's very outgoing, and I can definitely hear that through the conversation. You've got a great guy. It's all about really, and that's one of the things that I think that that segment of the market I think they haven't done enough to promote, you need to have that human interaction. You need to be able to communicate,
Well, the GCSAA is doing a good job, I think, of beginning to make those resources available.
They're starting to do that.
I mean, I can tell, from my PGA days, it's one thing to provide, it's another thing to bring the horse to drink the water.
Right.
So, there's again, we're in an environment now where the delivery of content is in so many different ways that you can adjust it and make it amenable to where people's comfort zones are. But, at the end of the day, there's so many other factors that are driving what someone's doing. There was always, and I keep going back to it, when I was at the PGA, we did an ad about the role of the golf professional. It was called the badge ad. I was actually talking to Don Ray about it on our podcast, because the current president. It was the PGA crest, and then it had all the roles that the golf professional plays, many of which go well beyond the actual job description.
Right. Yeah.
And the thing that's difficult about that, I mean, that's real. They've got to play all those different roles, which makes it really difficult sometimes to step out of those and to go into other areas. As I often would say, if you're choosing between implementing a new program versus making sure that Mrs. Smith is being treated well, when she brings her guest out, your livelihood's depending upon the latter.
Yeah. Yes.
So that understanding of the customer and that empathy is something that I think becomes really important.
And what's really another side to that is if you look at golf professionals and the superintendents, those two verticals, in many cases, I think they're trying to protect their position as opposed to being a little bit more forward thinking and taking a calculated risk. If I'm a superintendent, and I lose my job, for various reasons, it could be no fault. In fact, a good friend of mine lost his position, been there for 10 or 15 years now, and they had a change in GM. The GM wanted to make a change, and he's gone. Nothing that he did or didn't do. His opportunity for finding a position as good or better in that area is slim. He has to now uproot and go somewhere else. Now, in his case, it's not an issue, but I can definitely see you get to that middle age where and early on, I always felt like our customer was a 35 to 45-year-old, not the 55 to 65-year-old, because of that. So.
Yeah, it's and it's still there's still a lot of in every industry. There's still so much transience, and that's hard. That's why the best recommendation, which again is easier to say than do, is hardwire yourself throughout the organization so that if person A leaves, you still have a relationship with person B. Now, again, it's easy to say that. To do that is a whole other story.
Yeah.
And people have their own people. I mean, think about it: college coaching or pro sports coaching. I mean, it's just you're only as good as you were the other day. And
what have you done for me today?
Yeah, my favorite football team just fired their coach this week.
Penn State?
Well, pro team, Tennessee Titans.
Oh, Tennessee. Oh, yeah. Pro team. Oh.
Yeah, well, questionable the way they're playing this year. They're not looking like a pro team, but they are a pro team.
Yeah, you look at what happened to James Franklin at Penn State.
Yeah,
here's a guy that had a winning program, and all of a sudden he's kind of fallen a little bit on hard
three games in a row.
And you're gone.
UCLA. It's tough.
And they think the Savior's going to save their season. No.
Yeah, it's one of the things, you talk about what drives you to entrepreneurialism and that constructive paranoia. It's nice to, at least to some degree, control your own destiny.
Right. Yes.
Then you have nobody else to where I've always been all about personal accountability. That's my foundational belief. And, what happens and has happened to my company ultimately comes down to me, and I take responsibility for it. And I'd rather have that than other exogenous factors or the whims of people coming in to predicate that. That's one of the things that I just had a lot of trouble with in the years that I spent in corporate environments.
Right. Yeah. And, a little bit about history, I started as an engineer, and I always felt like whatever I did or made was dependent upon somebody else's opinion.
Yeah.
And that's why I jumped into sales, because I figured, hey, the harder I worked, the more opportunities I brought in, the more I got paid. It's all about performance. And so that's,
It's one of the things I always loved about golf, that it was just this meritocracy. It's not as much so as it was when I first started getting into it. But I mean, when I first developed my love affair with golf. I remember, guys who were like 65th or 70th on the money list were making substantially less money than most of the grown-ups that I knew.
Mm.
And, unlike other sports, even at that time, if you missed a cut, you didn't make anything.
Right.
That was great. I mean, the Q school was my favorite event because, and I did, this is, why do you become a researcher? I still remember back when the Q school was an automatic ticket to the tour.
Right.
I would always look, and this was more anecdotal. I didn't do it mathematically, though I could now. I would always find a couple guys who would qualify on the number by going low in the last round, like shooting a 65 to get their card by a stroke. And some ridiculously high percentage of those guys won their rookie year on the tour.
Wow.
Because they knew how to handle that situation.
Wow.
Should probably go back and do that analysis now.
Well, I think Scotty Scheffler is probably the perfect example.
Mm-hmm.
He had an okay career at the Korn Ferry Tour and gets on the PGA Tour, and he just kind of, whether or not, I think Ted Scott may have a little bit of influence on it, but all of a sudden he wins out of one event and he's off to the races. What clicked? What, he's got it. What is it? That's the question.
And you said it before. I mean, getting this whole sports psychology discussion. I mean, you know it from yourself and your sons, and I know it a little bit from my son on the baseball side. There's such a fine line between being a really good player or even a club professional who's a good player and being able to maintain that level or obviously exceed that level on the tour because it's a totally different game. I mean, I will always remember, when I was in college, I actually worked at the club that I now belong to. Kind of a nice story to go from the bag room to the first team. But there was an assistant there who was very successful in the Met PGA. It was winning everything, and he was just a super player. I looked up to this guy. He was my hero. I wanted to be him. He qualified for the U.S. Open one year, and it was at Winged Foot. It was 84.
Okay.
And he went out and unfortunately shot the two highest scores of the Open. What's the difference? Well, you can unpack that from a lot of different vantage points, but it's a lot of what's
between
here and what you're willing to, and there's a sacrifice too. Mm-hmm. It's the other thing about, you talk about scaling a business, right?
Yeah.
If we wanted to, we probably could go out and find, additional investment capital. Mm-hmm. But then you're selling parts of yourself, and then you're necessarily not having that ability to mold it exactly in the way that you are. So what's more important to you? You have to find what your comfort zone is. Some people, it's all about that exit strategy and making as much as they can and getting out. And then, I assume for you too, but for me, it's as much about a lifestyle. I love what I do. I want to be able to be involved in these interesting studies and help people, and I want to, rise or fall based on my efforts and not be akin to the whims of others. Yeah. So, if I don't sell my company for hundreds of millions of dollars, I'll be okay with that.
Well, it's kind of interesting because, I've had people, when I go see clients, I say, "Hey, how much golf are you playing? Come out and play." And I said, "I hardly play at all, but I'm having the time of my life."
No, and that's I still remember when I got to the PGA coming out of grad school. It was kind of funny. The guy who was the chief operating officer at the time, who became a real mentor to me, he kind of challenged me in the interview, and he was like, "You think you're going to come here and play all the time, aren't you?" I'm like, "No, I'm not a particularly good player. I'm excited about the opportunity to elevate the game." It was the right answer, and it was what I really believed. And that's what I always joked around. In fact, I remember someone saying to me, when you get into this organization and this business, you're not necessarily going to play as much. People think that's all you do. And it's true. I travel a ton. I'm on the road, obviously doing projects and presenting. And if it's a choice between staying an extra day and playing or getting back and being with my family, especially when my kids were younger, there was no question what I was going to do. I was going home.
Right. Yeah. There's that fine balance.
Yeah. But there's no one right answer. Right?
No,
I mean, for some people, it's all about driving, that prize. So you got to find your comfort spot.
Mm-hmm. 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 Well, I just hope Easy Locator becomes a legacy beyond my years. That's my dream.
That would be great. So you're thinking about it for others in your family, or thinking about it for others beyond?
It won't be a legacy business. That's okay. Because I've got from a direct family. they're not interested. But my three boys, everybody says, "Oh, your boys were good golfers and all this other stuff." I said, "Yes, they're great golfers. They in their own right. They found their own path." But the challenge is that one of the skills that they lack is the ability to marry technology with golf. And I recognized that early on. I never pushed them. I said, if y'all want to, in fact, one of them, my middle son actually got it when he got out of college. He was a good player, and he wanted to try his hands at pro golf. I said, great. What other better chance do you have when you're young and don't have a lot of things that you have to do? And his younger brother that was still in college, said, when he got out, he said, David, I'm going to be making more money in 5 years than you are. And it was correct. He didn't pursue the game afterwards. He got into the business world. But David, I think, doesn't have that regret.
Yeah, well, you never
looking
want
back saying, "Boy, I wish I would have tried."
You never want to have to say "what if." That was another, to the point about nuggets. I mean, that was something else that I always felt about for my kids. I never wanted them to say "what if" in terms of where they went to school or what they did. That to me is success, in that you've given somebody the opportunity to do what it is that they want to do, and you're pragmatic, and you can make mistakes at certain points in your life and not have to look back and say, well, what if I had done that?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have, like people say, what else would you have done? And I don't think, I wouldn't have changed a thing. I mean, the only other thing that I loved, which is kind of funny, and I found an outlet for it, is, I wanted to be a sports broadcaster. I thought, because, like in college, I was the PA announcer for my college. So I was, at the basketball and football games. I would have loved to have done that. It would have been fun.
Right.
But, it wasn't pragmatic, and I wasn't willing to, pick up and uproot myself at that point and go to a small market and claw and fight for that.
Right.
I also knew I had a lot of other things I could do. And so now I do the PA for, with my baseball tournament directing, I announce all the games that, the 95 games that we do during the tournament.
You get to do that.
I get to do that.
Yeah.
So that's fine. And I get to do podcasts like this. So that's how I get to, to
awesome.
actualize the broadcasting side.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for your time.